hazard gear on this time. My name is Kate Churchill. I'm a self-employed archaeologist based in Trellick, just outside Monmouth. I've been there for 6 years, so please do, I apologise for my Welsh pronunciations, I can't even say that, dear, because they're not great, but I'll give it a go. So I was asked to come along because at the moment there's a real drive to put in toilets into churches so they can be used more like church halls, for example, this evening. The last one I did was St Bride's in Llanelly, and if anyone knows that, that is another stunning church to go visit. But if you don't have a toilet, you need to have a septic tank and it needs to go in the churchyard. So every time we choose a space that doesn't have any monuments, but you can guarantee that we're going to find something. But here we found more than we were expecting, which was always a pleasant surprise. So starting off, before I approach any site, I do a very quick background to see what archaeological remains are in the area. So the first one is St Elli's. And everywhere around it was just listed as historic buildings associated with the post-medieval period. There was very little associated with anything earlier than that. Apart from Crugagare, okay, there's my first one, which is an Iron Age homestead about 700 metres to the northwest of here. And that straight away struck me because of the shape of it, the location on the hillside in comparison to where we are here. It's very similar. When you look at the yew trees here and measure the distance, it's about 50 metres, whereas Crugagare is 80 metres. But when you take into consideration something that we found when we were digging to the south, oh, there we go. There's the homestead there. So that's just in front of the south gate, and you can see it looks like speckles on here. It's not great to see, but they're all cobbles. Lots and lots of cobbles for about 11 metres. Straight below the ground surface, and it's made ground. So they built it up. So the first thought was it's to do with the landscaping of the churchyard, which in that area is a little bit later, or possibly for the road surface, but could it also be something earlier? Could there have been some ditches or any form of undulations that they've had to fill in the later period? And when you measure the distance between the north side of the yew trees down to the south gate, you're looking at about 80 metres. So there is some similarity there. At the moment, we don't have any information of anything prehistoric in this area, but that's purely because there haven't been investigations done here. It's not a reflection on the lack of archaeology, just the lack of investigations. So that's something to bear in mind. Moving forward. So what do we know? Well, St Elli's Church, with the yew trees, they have been looked at and said to be about 700 years old, but then they've been compared to other yew trees in the area, and they could be about 1,000 years old. The ring around the church itself is also indicative of a class church. So, looking at what other information do we have? Well, place names are normally a big thing. So St Elli's. So there could be two possibilities of why this church is dedicated to St Elli's. The first is St Elli, pronunciation again, who was the daughter of Rakan, who was a 5th century king who gave his name to Brecon. The problem is, I get very carried away when I'm supposed to just do a very quick archaeological background, but I get sucked into these things. And this king, I'm not going to say his name again, he had about 41 children. And none of them have the name Elli. Now there is Elli, which is the only daughter that he has with a name beginning with E. So, could be that one. She was beheaded when she was running away from a suitor which is quite unfortunate, but she became a saint for that reason. So it could be her, because she is in this area. So that happened on an Iron Age hill fort just on the eastern side of Brecon. But it could also be St. Elli, who was the foster son of St. Cadog. His mother was a queen of some islands somewhere in the Mediterranean. I say somewhere in the Mediterranean because no one actually knows where. They don't appear to exist. But he succeeded him as an abbot. Interestingly, of Llanelly, which was founded by Cadog after being chased by some military boar, which is another story. Just the ideas of Games of Thrones comes into your head when you're reading that. Anyhow, interestingly, Cadog was the grandson of this king in the middle. So it all starts tying in. So there's lots of crossover. This is definitely an area that needs to be researched more. And also, whichever patron saint that is, what are the patron saint of? Because that normally gives us a good indication. So St. Michael's are normally on the top of the hill. Sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head, but if they're a patron saint of fishermen, it's by the sea. So it would be really interesting to find out what they are the patron saint of, and how that relates to this church. Why is this one called St. Elli's? So there's a question. I don't know the answer. So with an early, what we do know, no matter which one it was, they are 5th or 6th century. So that suggests that this church was founded at that time, because the name goes out a date later. So we're looking at an early dedication. We've got the yew trees that could be 1,000 years old, and it's also on a potential earlier site, prehistoric site. So we have a really interesting site here. We know that St. Cadog and his followers did establish class churches, but they're often written about in the early records, and there aren't any records for St. Elli's here, but that doesn't mean it wasn't there. We are in the Marcher territory. Nothing is written ever, it seems. But it could also be a daughter church of a class church, so it might be a little bit less significant. So there's lots to look into. So turning to what we do know, so according to the documentation in the church, it was built between 1175 and 1250, with the north aisle added in 1626. Sorry, there's a lot of information I've got to go through. However, Cadw, the listings, say it's a little bit later with an earlier aisle, so things start getting very confusing again. But what we do know is the first record was in 1701. The bells are all have their own dates, and there was a series of 3 different renovations in the Victorian period. Just quickly looking at graveyards, because that's what I was here to have a look at. We have the tithe map from 1847, which shows the area of the yews to the south, with an interesting triangular northern boundary. I think that rings some alarm bells for me. Why is it triangular? That's an odd shape. Is it just the crossroads? I don't think so. It's a bit odd. So that would be something that, if I had lots of time, I would look into. Why is there a triangular northern boundary? 1879, you can see the graveyard has been extended here. So it's come southwards. The road has been realigned, which the made ground, the cobbles that I showed you earlier, that could be an instance of levelling for the graveyard and building up the road. And there's now a graveyard on the south side, and then in 1916 there's another graveyard off to the southwest. Not surprising, because this parish covers a huge area and some very influential people. So there's a lot going on. So moving on to the watching brief. So a watching brief is where an archaeologist watches the digger to just make sure that they don't go through anything, and if they do, it's my job to pick up the pieces and try and record it as quickly as possible. So we ended up doing 174 metres worth of trenching. Now, most of that was only about 40 centimetres wide, but it still ran from the corner of the church to the side, all around the western side, and then all the way down the road. So it was a very long trench that we separated into 5 trenches. That was for the water pipe, so you've now got lovely water. For the sewage pipes, you've now got a lovely toilet, and of course the septic tank. Most of the 3 main things that we found during the watching brief were the made ground layers that I've mentioned, the cobbles, the Victorian coal store, which you can just see on the scar. Can you see that line there? So that's the scar of the store. It doesn't particularly show in this one, but the ground was very black underneath from all the coal. It also had an awful lot of mortar in it, and that seems to have been from when the Victorians were renovating the church. They were using that area to store all their building supplies. So that was quite interesting. Everywhere else we had lovely red sand and subsoil, which I'll come on to. We also had a stone porch or stone patio or path in front of the church. So it was here. That's been replaced by the current one. And then we also had 3 charnel pits. Now, the charnel pits, whenever you have any Victorian renovation, they dig a hole very shallow, and anything that they come across, any graves they go through, they just pick up mostly the big bones and put them in this charnel pit. And every single excavation you do in a churchyard, you'll come across one of those, and they're normally between 10 or 20 centimetres below the ground surface. Because we were just doing the water pipe, we were able to just go around them. So we have a lovely water pipe that does that at the moment. So they're still in situ, they're still there. Just a sideline, I recently did a charnel pit in Monkswood in Usk, and the Victorian builders have filled the pit and decided to put a burial on top in the shape of the skull and long bones as the pirate symbol. So just 2 things to mention about the problems with watching briefs. You can see here just how long this trench was, which I'm amazed that you can't see any of it at all there now. They did a really good job reinstating it. But you can see how narrow it is, and it's really difficult to get any idea of the archaeology below looking through that tiny little slot. But we did our best. The second thing with Monmouthshire, I love Monmouthshire. I love the standing buildings of Monmouthshire. The archaeology is the hardest I've ever come across. And the reason for that is you have red sandy topsoil, red sandy subsoil, red sandy interface layer, red sandy sandstone that's very soft, and then the bedrock. All of this is very friable, and when you dig a hole, normally you have a cut on either side. Here, because the same material has been chucked in, there's no cuts. All the structures have been robbed out. The sandy soil is so acidic that it destroys bone, it destroys metal, so all you're left with is a whole load of pottery that you've got no idea how it's got there. And that's what we have here. But what you can vaguely see here is there's a line there with the darker soil from the coal store and then the slightly redder soil there. Now this is going through the area that we know that there are graves, and you can see that there's no grave cut whatsoever there. So, bearing that in mind, we were digging very happily for the septic tank, and didn't see any cuts. Went down to 1.5 metres, and suddenly this smell appeared, and this very dark line. So, oh dear. I'll talk you through what was around those first. So this is a section of the septic tank, trench. You can see here, this is the topsoil. Then we have the subsoil mixed with topsoil below it, followed by redeposited subsoil. It gets quite boring. Then we had just a very pure red sand that was very much like builder's sand, which is odd because you don't normally get that. You normally get bits of stone and things in. So that was a little bit odd. Then we had this black organic material that was had been collected at some point. It had been exposed, and it's just leaves blowing on. So that was interesting. We took a couple of samples. Then we came across a stony surface. Now I'm skimming over that because we'll come back to that later. But then underneath that was just the green, the greyish-green sand, the natural sand, virgin ground. So between those, we have this big cut, and this one. And you may be able to see what it says at the bottom there. So where are we? We're right in the northwest corner, where the circle is. Next to this monument here, which is dated 1865. Here is the digger going through, and that is the point that we've just started to get that black material with the coffin below it. So at that point we stop the watching brief and it becomes an excavation. So myself and a colleague then went in. We had to apply for a licence from the Ministry of Justice to exhume any bodies. And within one of those grave cuts, we found the earliest bit of pottery. So everywhere else, all the excavations we've done, we only found 19th or 20th century pottery. This is 13th century. Churned up in the 1865 grave. So, yeah, not great, but they're here doing something in the medieval period. So there's just a brief description of the grave cuts. So we had three. We had a large one that had 3 coffins in it that we presume is a family plot. And then we had 2 single plots that are about ½ a metre wide and ½ a metre in between them. So coffin 1 and 2. Coffin 1 we didn't really do very much with. It was right in, can you see it? It's right at the top, right in the edge of the section here. And we were able to just kind of fold it over so that it can remain in situ there. So he or she is very happy. Still there, unlike the colleagues. So coffin, and all of them were trapezoid in shape, and most of them were made of oak. They were in beautiful condition. They were really lovely. We weren't expecting that. As I say, the acidic soil tends to destroy pretty much everything. So to have these coffins was lovely. The issue they were well preserved was because they were in a very clay, waterlogged material, and last March was particularly wet. So the photos aren't great because you can see just how wet it was and how wet we became as well. The coffin one, we could see that there was a tin plaque with some flowers and urns on it. There's a common theme running through these about the plaques. When they first came up, it looked like silver. I was like, oh, this is amazing. But then we noticed that it wasn't, it was tin, but it had been painted black to look like lead. And this was quite a common thing that they were doing from the 1850s to make their coffins look very expensive. So coffin 2 had a central iron plaque that again had been painted black so that it looked like lead. It had coffin handles, and it also had a layer of sawdust on the bottom. just reminding myself. The few surviving bones. So the lid had folded in, the soil had been able to get in, and that had destroyed most of the bones, apart from those that were trapped between the lid and the base. This one was quite a complicated one. So we came across it and we thought, it's got a lovely lid, it doesn't look like it's collapsed. This is very unusual. But if you have a look, you can see the sides are just protruding up a little bit from the top. And we had assumed that the lid had just come down. Well, that in fact is the base, and the sides had slipped. So there were very little bones, as you can see here, just a few bits of tibia, femurs, and the vertebrae. But that did show us that the burial was in a supine position, so laying on its back, with the hands by their femurs by their legs. But only one burial in there. So coffin 3 was a bit more interesting. You can see just how well that has survived, how tall that was. Again, a similar sort of measurements, and all of them look quite small. Now, in most instances, it's because it had folded in, but they were on the smaller side. This had some beautiful coffin lace. So I've mentioned about the tin plaques. These were tin strips that had been pressed, and in this instance, this was the diamond, and it had a really lovely iron plaque, which we'll come to a bit later on. Again, it had handles. So here's the coffin lace. Here's one of the handles. Sorry, it's not easy to see on the photos. We had a wooden strip, a decorated wooden strip, which was unusual. We didn't have any of those in the rest of them. And then we have here a tibia, a leg bone, that's on top of the lid. So what's going on there? So this burial has two in it. So this is part of the large plot. This is the last one in that large plot. And it has a coffin burial to begin with, but then a shroud burial was put on top. The pine lid that we came across first, so it all starts off with all oak sides, and we thought, oh, they're just trying to save a bit of money by putting in a pine lid. We took off the pine lid, we found a burial, very nice. Then we took off what we thought was the pine base and found another lid underneath, which was the original oak. So they put in the second burial within the coffin after the original lid had collapsed and placed a pine lid on top. So there was two different plaques within there. There's a list of all the bones that we found. I'm not going to read it out, but it was of a young adult, and again it had been placed on sawdust. So then it was placed on top of the primary burial. This was the best preserved because it had the other burial in two lids placed on top of it. But even so, only the bones along the side were preserved. The rest were all dissolved. I should have mentioned there are skeletons in this talk. So if you do not like to see any skeletons, please leave. I should have said that. So here's a plan of what we found. Now you'll see that we're missing something quite substantial, and that was the top half of all the burials. Our trench didn't go that far, so we did only excavate from about here down. But you can see just how well preserved this bottom one is. Here it is inside of the coffin itself, with the bones there. This one was slightly older because it had evidence of arthritis on its hip bones. The pelvis was slightly, it's dissolved in the middle, but the greater sciatic notch was visible, so we could tell that it was a male. Again, it had sawdust, but this one had lead round the side, which was quite interesting because that holds everything in. Not so great for us when we removed the clay and a whole load of liquid came out of them all over our shoes. So moving on to coffin 4. Again, trapinus origin shape, made of oak, this time with a pine base. So they were trying to save money in this instance. The south side and the lid had completely collapsed and almost dissolved, which was unfortunate, but it did have, it's really nice on the picture there, really lovely coffin lace running all around the base. Here's a picture of it here, it's in an oval pattern. We also had a shadow of iron handles within it. And then there's more of the coffin lace there, and that does show, sorry I can't see it on it, that does show, really, if anyone would like to see these pictures afterwards, please come and see me, but it does show how we had another burial on top of the lid. This one was quite interesting, second and third burial. This one was interesting because so it had rolled onto its side, the vertebrae, here. The vertebrae is on its side and up against the lid, the sides. And the leg was pretty much over the edge of the coffin as well. So this one looks like it's been chucked in. It hasn't been placed. Because that wouldn't have happened once all the soil had gone on top, because that would have prevented movement, so it's happened as it's been thrown in. Which, whenever you're dealing with any skeletons or burials, there's always some tragedy around it, but when you find things like this, it's quite difficult. But what else did we have? So there's one of the legs inside, this is the leg outside. And then we've got more iron staining, and it's really not that visible here, but there's a piece of what we thought was lining at that point. So when you're excavating Victorian burials, if they're very nice on the outside, they're probably going to be very nice on the inside. So that means linings, whether it's the lining of the coffin itself, or whether there's pillows, and they're often made of lamb's wool or horsehair. Now that can carry anthrax. So at that point, as soon as we think that there's any form of linings, we've got to get fully kitted up, because if we open that coffin and breathe in any of the spores, then after 3 weeks of feeling like we've got a cold, it's fatal and there's no cure. So this suddenly turned into a bit of a scary excavation, because we had no way of telling without doing any testing whether we were at risk. So for a week, you may have seen us looking like we were part of CSI or something going in and out. But I'm still alive. I'm assuming my colleague is. So. But here we were excavating it, thinking, ha, another secondary burial. Excellent. Hang on, there's a third hand. Where's this third hand come from? Oh, and there's a third leg as well. That's all we found of the secondary one, just a leg and another hand. But there are 3 burials in this one. And then there on top of the primary burial, of which very little survived. It was a sub-adult, so it was a child. We were able to determine that because the femur still survived, and the measurement of the femur was very much on the small side. What was fascinating about this one, so very little survived. You can see, or you can't see, you can see on there, there's part of the lid. Hang on, where is it? This is part of the lid here. and part of the lid here, and that's the only place where the primary burial survived, beneath those. So basically within this material here. This part was at the bottom. So looking at the femur, we would estimate that the individual was about 7 years old. And I'm not sure if you can see, but all in here, there's some narrow leaves that are just like lily leaves. And they were only isolated in one area, and it looks like a bouquet of lilies had been laid at their feet. Now, when you come across things like that, that suddenly turns your work into something a little bit more. So finally, we have coffin 5. Again, this was right up into the corner. When we first came across it, it looks like we had an iron coffin, because we just saw an iron stain all the way around. But when we excavated it, we found that all the wooden sides and lid had completely disappeared, and all we were left with was more of the oval-shaped lace, coffin lace running around. You can see the bone just, again, surviving only in the very corners of the coffin, but the plaque, the central plaque that would have been about here, had survived beautifully, and it was a fleur-de-lis. There's not an awful lot more to say about that one, because it just didn't particularly survive. I think I just mentioned that. Oh yes, and it was a grey-style adult, so someone really quite slender and small, so probably a female. So here we have the pelvis and the arms coming down. Here is a collection of the hand bones. So again, in a supine position on their back with their hands down by their legs. And then evidence of the iron staining from the handles on the side. So here's some pictures of the lace and the plaques once they've been cleaned up. They were so friable, they really were disintegrating as you touched them, so we're really lucky to be able to get these. And I've got some here today, if anyone would like to have a look. But it's the first time I've come across the coffin lace and plaques in this good condition. You normally just get a shadow. So we were really lucky to find that. And it just tells us what the people around here are doing and thinking, and they want to give their family members a really good burial. They have the money to do so, although they are cutting a few corners, but then who doesn't? But it also gives us a date. So I mentioned that the tomb next to it was 1865, and this type of material is being done from the 1850s. So we know, we're pretty certain that the burials that we have are spot on for 1865, 1870. That part of the churchyard, as far as I'm aware, only started from the 1850s through to the 1900s. And we have they're all in a nice line. So if we were to go back, and I say that because of the next slide, we know where all the burials are likely to be. So I mentioned very earlier about a stone surface and a black material. So here was the stone surface. Here's my colleague Jeff digging in a pond, it looks like. But we found lots of green sandstone, pebbles, little bits of cobbles that had all been placed together, almost tessellated, and it very much looked like a kind of grotto, the way that it had been laid. So it was purely cosmetic. It wasn't a functional surface. There's no way this would have been used as a yard for animals. It was visually beautiful to look at. It was in really poor condition, but it would have been stunning at the time. So we assumed that it was probably Victorian, because similar things are Victorian grottos, but the burials cut through it. So we have, there's one of the coffins here, and here, and here, and the surface extends up there and there. And so it predates 1860. So we thought we'd do a radiocarbon dating on it, on the material, the black material on the top of it. Our thoughts were either it's where the vegetation has all accumulated over it when it's gone out of use, or it could have been inside a building that had a thatch top and the thatch has fallen down. But either way, interesting to have it radiocarbon dated. That came back on Monday. It took a lot of persuading. And it came back to 721 years old, which places it the same date as the yews were potentially being planted and the church was built. Now that is a date of it going out of use, not the date of it being built, which then adds a whole new aspect of, so what's going on here? There is a structure there, just checking, yes there, that has a very ornate surface, and in the corner of the surface, just here, there is evidence of rubble. So it could be that we're on the edge of a structure there, a structure that predates this church, which then adds a whole new element to what is going on here. Interestingly, when I was doing this talk, I put it's in one of the first slides, the aerial photograph of the yew trees, and there is a break in the yew trees just there. Now, I don't know how long that break has been there, but is it a coincidence? Don't know. I'm wondering what to say, because the first thing that comes into your head of when you've got a beautiful kind of grotto type thing, is it any form of shrine? We have an early dedication, who knows? So what's next? I can tell you what not to do. Once you've reinterred the burials, you do not leave the finds bags in the back of your car for your husband to drive to the Forest of Dean and get pulled over by the police. For them to look in the boot and find hollowed bags that say human remains. You do not do that. That's one of his stories now forever. But what I would love to do is firstly have a look at the church records and find out in the 1865, 1870s, are there any families that fit the description, have a 7-year-old, have a slightly older male, and then an older male on top of that, who die in a similar time frame to each other. Just see if we can get a name to these individuals. I think that would just be really lovely. Then explore the connections between St. Elli, the saint, and here. Why here? What's going on here? Why is St. Elli's important for this area? As well as looking at other, because the prehistoric settlements have been looked further over in Brecon Beacons, but not so much here. And there is evidence of more prehistoric activity going on. Then looking at other class sites. So there are a lot in Monmouthshire. How do they compare to this one? And then finally, start digging. That's all, I'm always going to say that. We know where the burials are. We don't need to hit the burials. We can go in between the burials and have a look at this surface, see if there is the structure there, find out more about the structure, more about what's going on in this area before this current church. And I think that's really key, because we don't know much about early medieval churches in Wales, or Monmouthshire. And here we've got a great opportunity, because that surface is really well preserved. To get a date like that, the sample went off to the University of Bristol. They said it was perfect for doing radiocarbon dating. They rarely get good samples like that. So there is so much potential here. It's really exciting. Yes, and hopefully in years to come I'll be doing another talk with everything else that we found. So thank you very much to everyone that is listed here, and if you'd like to see any of the finds or have a chat and see any of the photos in greater detail, please let me know.